Thank you and welcome everybody. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Let me know if that's working okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Brilliant, thank you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great, excellent. Okay. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for your time today. It's really great to see so many of you here. My name's Jarvis. I work, as Juliet just said, as a professor of international politics at Loughborough University. And I thought I would talk to you today about the study of security in surprising places, in mundane, seemingly insignificant sites of social and political life, and to think a little bit about the types of object, the types of text, the types of experience we might find there, and how engaging seriously with surprising constructions and experiences of security might enrich the field of international studies. I thought I'd begin with a few contextual comments about some of the things that have happened within the discipline of security research over the last 20 or 30 years or so. And then I'll say a little bit about 3 projects in which I've been involved that try to engage with this kind of line of thinking, if you like. The projects I want to talk about were conceived separately. They're not part of a series of research. So I'm giving myself a bit of a tricky task to try and bring them all together into one 40-minute or so talk, but I'll do my best and we'll see how we go. All of the work that I'm going to talk about in a broad sense engages with the ways in which security threats and responses to security are discursively constructed in everyday vernacular or banal contexts. And I'll make sure to leave some time at the end for some questions and discussion as well. So I'll start very broad and then narrow down. A useful starting point for my talk might be just to think very briefly about the dramatic expansion of security studies across the past 30 years or so. I don't know how many of you have studied security yet, but it's sometimes hard to keep track of the ways in which this field has really broadened and grown. It's quite common to hear about new turns within security research that encourage us to take seriously previously neglected things or topics. We see new methods being introduced, often through engagement with other fields of research, gender studies, migration studies, cultural studies, and so on. There's been a whole range of new frameworks introduced through which we might theorize security. So I'm thinking here about work on things like ontological security, which is interested in people's identity. But also vernacular security studies, which is interested in how everyday people talk about security, and a whole range of different schools of security thinking as well. And there are obviously important differences between work that I'm bracketing together under this big, broad heading here. But I think if we take it collectively, we can argue that work in this vein constitutes something of a movement away from a traditional way of thinking about security and a traditional set of moorings through which security has always been historically studied. So it's a movement in this work away from a state-centric view of world politics, getting us to think about other actors and why they might be important. A shift away from rationalism, so getting us to think about actors as something more than interest maximizers. A shift away from military power, military force as the dominant sort of driver of change in the international system, and a shift away from a sort of materialist and positivist methodological framework as well. So thinking about the study of security as something that need not necessarily proceed scientifically. Within this broad movement away from traditional ways of studying security, I think a really important development, and one that's been really useful to me in my efforts to try to understand developments in international security, has been an effort to demonstrate that security isn't a real objective phenomenon that exists out there in the world waiting for us to discover it. Instead, to think about security as something that we create or we produce. Security is something that becomes real through our shared understandings, through our discourses. And there are lots of very well-known examples here. I've put 3 or 4 on the slide. Roxanne Doty's work on the textual construction of reality in American counterinsurgency policy was very important. David Campbell's work on US foreign policy, and the way in which danger is vital to self-identity. Jutta Wells has done lots of work on the discursive construction of foreign policy crises in relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis and beyond. And from a slightly different background, the work of people like Barry Buzan, Ollie Weaver on securitization, the ways in which particular issues become constructed as security threats and rather than normal political challenges, if you like. And I think that work has been really important for putting attention to the contestable and the contingent way in which security issues become understood and therefore become governed. It's helped us to highlight the productive power of security texts, if you like. And in more recent work, and this work really is sort of now speaking to what I'm going to share with you today in terms of my own research, we've seen a whole series of efforts take on these initial sort of this initial insight of the work of these authors here and start to apply them in much more mundane, much more banal, much more everyday context. So to think about the ways in which security is written or constructed, not only in the language of political elites, not only in national security strategies or counter-terrorism laws or the very big, very elite, top-down sorts of site of politics, but to think about this in a much more bottom-up, micro-level, everyday sense. And there's a list of literature here that I think has been really important in making that move towards everyday bottom-up understandings of security, feminist scholarship, post-colonial scholarship and beyond. And we can perhaps talk about any of that later if that's of interest to anybody. I find this work quite important and quite exciting for a couple of reasons. I think in the first instance, it encourages us to recognize that we lose a lot if we only think about security politics at the very big macro level, at the level of sort of war, political elites, national security doctrines and so forth, that security is something that is engaged, experienced, constructed in all sorts of places. As John and Nyman put it in a recent piece, security emerges in bedrooms and subways, public parks, supermarkets, social media feeds, the Buffyverse and beyond. So I find this kind of work enriching, that we can look at a whole range of things that might otherwise be neglected. It's also been methodologically liberating, I think, that if we recognise that security politics takes place in all sorts of unusual places, we might therefore be encouraged to experiment with different methods for engaging with those places. We might need different methods for taking seriously video games and how they construct security than for engaging with political elites and their understandings. I think a third important insight of this work was to demonstrate that security texts, constructions of security, are often complex. They often do more than one thing. Kyle Grayson's piece on A Bear Called Paddington, for instance, I think is fantastic because it demonstrates how this children's literature both reproduces a dominant liberal understanding of the foreign in the personification by Paddington Bear, but also how it contests that as well. And similar work by people like Laura Shepherd, Will Claps and others on things like Game of Thrones. This work, I think, what I'm trying to say is it shows us that constructions of security are often more complex than we might instinctively think. And therefore, because of that, we might look at everyday forms of security as a way of critiquing or problematizing or destabilizing dominant security discourses. There might be critical power or critical purchase in things that have historically been neglected. Okay, that's the sort of preamble to my talk. That's some broad background, I guess, to give you a little bit of a sense of where the three projects I wanted to very briefly talk about are situated. And as I said at the beginning, I thought I'd talk about three different ways in which I've attempted to pursue this kind of line of thinking. Each of these projects are collaborative, so I'm not only talking about my own work, these ideas are very much shared and collaborative. They also engage with quite different objects, quite different conceptual frameworks and methods. So I'll give you the references to the work that I'm going to talk about here at the very end of the presentation in case you wanted to follow up on any of it. I thought I'd start by saying something about terrorist obituaries. And again, so this sort of speaks to this big point that I'm trying to make so far, that obituaries are not something we would instinctively think about looking at as students of international relations or students of international security. But I think they're a really interesting literary genre, and it's a genre of writing that has been around at least since the 17th century in the English language as well, but that hasn't attracted very much interest from scholars in the kinds of disciplines that we're thinking about today, the kinds of disciplines represented by organisations like ESA. And I've been taking part in a project with Andrew Whiting, who works at Royal Holloway, looking at what obituaries of dead terrorists might tell us about contemporary understandings of security and contemporary understandings of terrorism. This is a relatively new phenomenon, but when very high profile individuals that are widely thought to be terrorists, people like al-Baghdadi, leader of ISIS, or bin Laden, leader of al-Qaeda, when those kinds of high profile figures die, we find them increasingly obituarized in the mainstream news media. That didn't take place 30 years or so ago. It's part of a general shift in the kinds of people that obituaries focus upon. And what we did in this particular piece of work was to put together a corpus of obituaries, looking at how 11 different terrorists, we could talk more about how that word is used and who it gets applied to later. So I'm using it very much in sort of scare quotes, if you like. How these figures get obituarized after their death. And the argument that we try to make in this piece of work is that how we remember those we are supposed to hate, those we are supposed to be fearful of, might be important for thinking about other things in terms of the politics of security and the politics of terrorism. And to illustrate what I mean by that, one of the most prominent findings that came up to us from this work is that the figure of the terrorist, as positioned or produced within obituaries in the mainstream English news media, is an overtly masculinized one, that the figure of the terrorist is positioned as an identifiably and explicitly male figure, that these people, these men, when they die, are characteristically remembered through very overtly masculinized tropes, language, characteristics. So we see this in the widespread use of masculine nouns and monikers, founding fathers, poster boys, grand old men, sort of run through these obituaries. We see it too in depictions of their hobbies and their pastimes that fit with very sort of overtly masculinized conceptions of how men spend their free time, sort of hiking and shooting guns and drinking whiskey, smoking tobacco, and that sort of thing. And we see this very sort of masculinized construction of these men too, in the amount of attention that is given to their always overtly heterosexual family lives, to the wives that they have, the children that they sire, and so forth. And so there's a broad conception of masculinity that we argue shapes the figure of the terrorist in this genre. But as people have shown us from looking at other kinds of text, there's variation within this as well, that the figure of the dead terrorist is a masculinized figure, but it's not a consistent one. We see different types of masculinity being presented here. And we argue there are three different archetypes at work in these obituaries, that in the first instance, we see the dead terrorist being reproduced as a sort of fighter or warrior figure, an aggressive, combative man who has sort of ample physical resources associated with strength and violence, but is also marked by a psychological inclination toward excessive violence. So the cold-blooded executioner, the capricious and cruel monster, this kind of writing. And the obituaries often point to backdrop of these terrorist lives and run-ins with the law they had as children, or fights they got into in the school playground, that sort of thing, as evidence of this sort of psychological inclination toward violence in their biographies. There's a second archetype, though, in which the dead terrorist is also written as much more of a sort of strategist figure, as a mastermind, as a genius, as someone able to outwit rather than to outfight their enemies. And there's lots of reference to their tactical and strategical innovations. The mastermind trope comes up time and time again in these in these obituaries as well, and the extent to which the terrorist, as a man of cunning and reason, has been able to sort of succeed so long in thwarting the actions of those who would counter them. And then the third archetype we speak about in this work is the figure of the terrorist as a leader, with lots of references again in these obituaries to the sort of charismatic authority of leadership figures, to their ability to control and discipline their organizations. So the argument we try to make is that this writing of the figure of the terrorist as an intensely masculine figure augments the threat that terrorism poses by associating terrorism with stereotypically masculine qualities like strength, rationality, agency, authority. But it also gives us a particular explanation of terrorist violence as somehow rooted in masculinity. It draws upon very sort of long-standing essentialist ideas about biology and so forth. But as we might expect, and come back to some of the comments I made earlier on, things are not quite as straightforward as that, because these obituaries don't only reproduce dominant ways of thinking about masculinity, they also play with them and sometimes disrupt them. And so there are examples in this genre of the masculinity of dead terrorists being explicitly brought into question as well, either through sort of questioning their military competence. The top example here was in the case of George Habash, who is contrasted quite explicitly with the sort of real fighters of his organization that were much more adept at combat than he was. There are references to submissiveness, passivity, cowardice, weakness, insecurity. Nice example of this, I think, is this presentation of bin Laden as the world's sort of biggest, baddest terrorist, but is also getting told off by his mum and just sort of letting that happen to him. And then, as in the case from one of al-Baghdadi's obituaries at the bottom, also very sort of explicit attempts to feminize their subject, to feminize the dead terrorist through depicting them in very stereotypically feminine language or subject positions. And al-Baghdadi in this case behaved like a secretary serving the tea at meetings and fading into the background. It's a very different construction of that man and his threat than some of the others we've been looking at. So just to sort of finish this part of the talk, I guess I wanted to show you that engaging with something like obituaries, it seems a long way away from the kinds of things we typically look at in international relations. But as a sort of very ordinary, very everyday text that we're familiar with and we encounter in the course of our daily lives kind of thing, obituaries might shed important light on the politics of security, on the international politics of security, in ways that we might otherwise miss. They can show us how constructions of threat draw on and reproduce and play with long-standing ideas around things like gender and beyond. So I think that has value for students of global politics, because it helps to sort of supplement and fill gaps in our existing knowledge of such things. I thought I'd say a few quick words now about a very different kind of security text. So moving away from obituaries of terrorists and looking at something a bit more joyful, I guess. I thought I'd say a little bit about children's picture books and draw on some work I've been doing here with Nick Robinson at the University of Leeds. And children's picture books are a bit like terrorist obituaries in one way, I guess, in that they've not had much attention in the field of international relations. They're really neglected. And I think that neglect is sort of understandable, because children are pretty neglected in IR as a discipline, at least until very recently. So children, where they're written about in fields like international studies, have tended to be written about when they're victims of violence or child soldiers or vulnerable to radicalisation, that sort of thing, not in a much more holistic sort of nuanced way than that. Things are changing, and there are lots of important scholars doing this kind of work now, but I think the gap is still to an extent there. And an argument I've tried to make with Nick Robinson is that actually children's picture books in particular, are really important sites of global political life. They enjoy a massive readership. I wish my books sold in the sort of numbers that some of these do. They're read by millions of people all around the world that are often young and curious about the world. They also, I think, often contain creative and important critical reflections on how global politics work. And because of the genre, they also might be particularly open to sort of subversive or anti-hegemonic readings of the world. And so I thought I'd say just a few brief words about one particular children's book, The Gruffalo, which will be familiar to many of you, I think. I think is a fantastic engagement with the politics of security for reasons I'll sort of share with you now. But in case you're not familiar with the book, it was first published in 1999. It's been so successful commercially and critically. There's all sorts of spin-off, commercial sort of spin-offs, from theatre shows to books to plates, whatever it is. And if you don't know the story, it's a story of about a mouse who travels through the deep dark wood and encounters a succession of predators, a fox, an owl, a snake, and ultimately a gruffalo, all of whom essentially want to eat the mouse, but end up being outwitted by this very small character. And the argument that we try to make in this particular article that was published in a BESA journal, Review of International Studies, is that the Gruffalo offers a compelling and a complex engagement with the politics of security because it gives us at least three different stories about how security politics works. That in the first instance, we can read this book as anyone that studied international relations will know what I mean by political realism, right? As a very stereotypically realist story about how international politics works. We have here a completely anarchical world where life is nasty, brutish, and short. It's inhabited by self-interested survival seekers. We don't have a metaphorical state of nature in the book. We have a literal state of nature. It's a deep, dark wood of fallen trees and various sort of fauna of differing capabilities. There's no overarching power in the wood. None is entitled to command. None is required to obey, to sort of use Kenneth Waltz's phrase there. There is no sort of authority that the characters must submit themselves to. And the ways in which outcomes are produced in the book, The Gruffalo, are through a series of meetings, through a series of dyadic encounters, to use IR terminology, between two characters. So two characters meet each other and an outcome emerges. And those encounters are interesting, I think, because this is how lots of IR theory historically has worked, to imagine what happens if two characters meet each other and to think through potential outcomes. So the style of the book reproduces the sort of thing we're familiar with from IR theory, but also because it shows us different ways in which this particular security dilemma might be escaped by rational, self-interested, survival-seeking characters through things like external balancing or bandwagoning with the Gruffalo and so forth. So we can read the book as an exercise in political realism, right? It tells us how to survive in a dangerous world where there is no 911 that you can call. You have to rely on your own wits, your own capabilities. But one of the reasons I think the book is so compelling is it also negotiates that very realist understanding of security by showing us quite clearly, I think, how security threats can be produced or imagined or constructed by clever or capable characters. That one of the things that's interesting about the book is that until the halfway point, the Gruffalo doesn't exist. Mouse is imagining this character, creating it, sort of conjuring it up. The sort of turning point in the book is when Mouse realizes that the Gruffalo actually is a real character. But that doesn't change the outcomes in the book, right? The other creatures are as scared of the Gruffalo when it's real and in front of them as they are when it is imaginary and being depicted by Mouse. So it tells us something about the ways in which security threats can be constructed by powerful actors, if you like. It tells us something also about perhaps the exceptional nature of security politics, because the one thing that does sort of mark the Gruffalo out from the other predators in the book is its sort of monstrosity, its otherness there. And also the ways in which the politics of security are run through with a sense of urgency, that the encounters that structure the book story are always structured around this threat that's just around the corner, right? That the meetings are always going to be here by these rocks or here by this stream. There's always just about to happen, and that sort of sense of urgency and fear that helps to amplify the politics of security, if you like. So we've got two very different stories about how security works, running through what seems like a very trivial story, a children's picture book. We've got a political realist story of an inherently dangerous world in which characters have to rely on their own capabilities to survive. And we've got a constructivist story, if you like, showing us how security threats are conjured up by political actors and how this shapes the way in which other characters respond to perceived threats. That's quite a lot already in a pretty short book with not many words in it. But the argument I'm making this particular article is that the book does even more than that. Also gives us opportunity to think about how security is constructed and by whom. It gets us to think about the ways in which security stories are always the stories of somebody. The security isn't something that is universal and experienced in the same way by all characters. When we think about security, we should ask, whose security are we thinking or talking about? And the book does a really nice job of showing us this, I think, because the story of the Gruffalo is told entirely through the character of Mouse. It's the story of security in the Gruffalo is the story of Mouse's security. The plot's driven by the movement of this one character through the wood or through the habitats and homes of its other inhabitants. Mouse is present on every single page. It's only Mouse's actions that matter. And because the story is written in this particular way and visualized in this particular way as well, I think it shows us how what seem like universal or singular stories of security are actually very rooted to the experiences of particular characters. We might ask, I guess, what would the story of the Gruffalo look like if it was told by Fox or Snake or by the Gruffalo himself? So we might read the book then not only as a realist or a constructivist engagement with security politics, but also as a way of critiquing those stories and the parochialism upon which they rely, that it can show us how taken for granted narratives generate taken for granted politics. Readers of the book are encouraged to sort of root for Mouse, even though this is the character that's sort of trampling through the habitats of all the other creatures and brings the Gruffalo back with them. Okay, so to bring that sort of second example to a close then, I guess the argument I'm trying to make is that picture books are important because they help in the construction of the politics of security, and they're really compelling forms of engagement with security because they're often aesthetically quite striking, they're very elegant and concise, and they're very influential because they're so widely read. And they give us resources for understanding how security politics is thought about in the world, but also perhaps for critiquing them and for showing their biases, the things that get hidden or forgotten, while demonstrating that security politics can be told in quite different ways. So I hope you're still with me. I was going to just speak for another 5 or 6 minutes or so and then pull things to a close, if that's okay. I thought I would turn finally to a different kind of everyday engagement with security politics and talk about a book I've got coming out with Stuart MacDonald and Andrew Whiting in a week or two, I think, with Manchester University Press. And what the book tries to do is to think about how ordinary people like us, ordinary citizens, non-elites, think about radicalisation and counter-radicalisation, and how they talk about that in the context of their everyday experiences as, in this case, students of higher education institutions in England and Wales. So the book that I'm sort of turning to now was written out of an interest in how students in England and Wales think about radicalisation and counter-radicalisation. We ran a series of focus groups with students from a range of different universities on these questions. And the sort of big conceptual framework that runs through this is this idea of vernacular security, a framework that's been around since a really influential article by Niels Boubant that was published 20 years ago now, looking at the everyday security speak of ordinary citizens. This is what vernacular security tries to get at. And so I won't labour this sort of theoretical framework here, but what the broad conceptual approach that underpins the argument I'm going to share with you in a second is this idea that security is an empty concept, doesn't mean anything in its own right. It only becomes meaningful when it's used by people in particular times and places. Because of that, how ordinary people think and talk about security in the supermarket, in the bedroom, in the workplace, wherever, matters. That has political significance, it has moral significance, and so forth. This leads to an interest in this kind of work, in how security issues, the security threats are depicted or constructed, that the language, the metaphors, the pictures that are used to characterize security matter in their own right. But also that we should be therefore cautious about generalizing, that particular understandings of security and insecurity, particular understandings of terrorism or migration or COVID-19, whatever, don't necessarily translate into wider claims that we can make about public opinion and so forth. So share just 2 or 3 quick findings from this book, and then I'll stop and open the conversation up for any discussion or any questions. I'm really interested in what you all think, and if any of you are engaging work in this area or interested in this kind of thing. A couple of quick observations that run through this book. Firstly, participants in our research think about radicalization in quite different ways, that it's not obvious that radicalization means the same thing to ordinary people. That might not be surprising, but I think that assumption is often there, and we speak a little bit about different understandings of this threat, this phenomenon within sort of everyday experiences and lives of students in the United Kingdom, and differentiate between people that spoke to us about radicalization as a sort of process that happens to people. This is the dominant political understanding at the moment, and compared that with understandings of radicalization as something more like an attitude, something that was about holding on to anti-liberal, anti-democratic beliefs and a sort of hostility to particular groups and so forth. So a different set of understandings about threat, and within that, different understandings of where radicalization comes from, how it is driven, what the causes of it are, if you like. And we got into lots of discussion in these focus groups around things like the importance of communities versus the importance of individual grievances and so forth. And work in this broad area, sort of vernacular security studies, I think is useful because it can try to map some of these things. It can get us to think about the differences between which people think and talk about such threats and security challenges. We encountered, as you'd expect probably, some concern as well with the politics of radicalization and with the terminology that is used to characterize however radicalization is being used. So a number of participants in our groups argued that this was a terminology that was vague and ambiguous and therefore unhelpful, that it doesn't do the sort of analytical work that we might hope it might. We had lots of people reflect on the sort of pejorative connotations of this term, like terrorism. It's sort of hard to use the language of radicalization neutrally or objectively. No one talks about themselves very frequently as being a terrorist or having been radicalized. These are labels that we tend to use to talk about other people in a critical sense, typically. We encountered lots of discussions about subjectivity, that people will have different understandings of what constitutes radicalization, and concerns too that the term is used in very specific ways to discredit or demonize either particular kinds of organization, or even worse, to discredit or demonize particular kinds of community. And lots of discussion about the politics of race that run around things like dominant ways of thinking through the threat posed by terrorism and extremism. From that sort of critique, we also encountered critique of efforts to counter radicalization through things like the UK Prevent strategy. Lots of concern that although something is a regular argument we encountered was that something was needed to address the threat of radicalisation in places like the UK. There were real concerns with how the British government and others attempt to do this, that it's very hard to measure the success of strategies like Prevent. It's hard to evaluate the costs that they bring about, and especially fears that they might have negative impacts upon things like citizenship, upon multiculturalism and beyond as well. And these are the kinds of vernacular perspectives on the Prevent strategy that we talk about in the second half of the book, really. Why does any of that matter? Well, again, in a similar way to my earlier comments about obituaries of terrorists and children's picture books like the Gruffalo, I think these kinds of bottom-up experiences of security and insecurity matter for 3 or 4 reasons. Firstly, because it just adds descriptive richness to our understanding of global politics. Right, these things are out there to be taken seriously, and I think engaging with how ordinary people, for want of a better phrase, think and talk about security enables us to tell more stories about security, and to think in a much sort of wider and richer sense than a focus purely on political elites and their decision-making processes. I think this kind of work opens up, again, new opportunities for critique, for discussion, for analysis. It gives space to perspectives and experiences that might otherwise be hidden, forgotten, or overlooked. It might offer insight into wider issues around how publics understand social and political life. So when people talk about things like radicalisation, they often also end up talking about a whole series of wider issues like the politics of race, the politics of gender, the workings of public policy and so forth. So engaging in these kind of conversations can add additional insight into wider public conversations. And finally, vernacular research, I think, also enables us to reflect on the resonance of dominant top-down ways of doing security politics, to think through whether or not publics use the same kind of language, have the same kind of experiences as political elites. So I am going to bring things to a close there. I'm really grateful to you all for your time today, for bearing with me and for listening to my thoughts. At a minimum, I hope that hopefully I've highlighted some of the ways in which security emerges in unexpected places, in surprising spaces, and hopefully to begin thinking about and uncovering some of the alternatives to dominant ways of thinking about security, to take seriously text, practices, objects, and so forth that traditionally a field like security studies would not have engaged with. There's obviously a sort of creative work on the part of the analyst. Anyone doing this kind of work has to recognize, of course, that they bring their own biases, baggages, and assumptions to it. But my main point, I guess, is I hope and I think that this kind of work opens opportunity for future research in the kinds of work that you and others will do. Think about how security is stored in other kinds of picture books beyond the Gruffalo. How do other memory projects depict threats that have passed and so forth? Is this sort of work, are these sorts of findings generalizable? Are they replicable? Would we even want them to be? So I think that really is more than enough now. So I think I'll leave it there and I'll stop sharing my slides. Oh no, I'll leave my slide with the sort of references for my talk there, but that's me done.